Okay, so diving into this retro. First, I want to ask like a big question. This is a question maybe about you said earlier a lot of structural things. And before we dive into any of those specifically, what were the other big themes?
Yeah, I think there was sort of two sides of the equation, like the structural side, which was around like where we work, how we work, the tools that we use to work, like very nuts and bolts game development structure side of the equation. And then I think a lot of the learnings on the other side of the equation were around like choosing the product and understanding what we wanted to make and how to make it differently than how we did with Dauntless or Fae Farm. One of the really cool things about having run Phoenix for almost a decade and gone from sort of like a venture backed independent company, and then we went through early access with Dauntless, and then we did a big cross play launch with Dauntless, and then we got acquired by a public company, and then we spent 3 years as part of a public company, which is a whole different world than anything else.
Yeah.
And then, spun back out of a public company, and we were back to being an independent with a different management structure. And so we had started with this really small team in Vancouver doing one thing. And by the time we were leaving, we were 350 people. There were 4 studios. We had multiple games in development. And so we'd had way more experience than you would imagine from a single company. We'd basically got to try to call it 7, 8, 10 different versions of running a company over that
Right.
10 years. And so we knew a lot of things that hadn't worked and a lot of things that had worked. And so I think the product side was it was a huge piece of starting this.
Yeah, absolutely.
We didn't go into it with, we're here to make this particular dream game of ours, which a lot of startups in games start because a person has a game that they want to make. And so I think one of the big differentiators for us is that's not the approach that we took for product.
Yeah, and I think and like the picking process was different. The kind of what the industry, when we started Phoenix in 2014, I can remember explaining to investors what the concept of an underserved audience was. I can remember explaining, like,
Yeah.
you and I both worked at Riot, and like we know lots of Blizzard folks. Like that's kind of like par for the course in those days for those group of folks, because that was the core business thesis for the. You think about League, where it was like, what if Dota was better?
Yeah.
And or Valorant is like, what if CS was better, right? And like, hey, the audience isn't being served well enough, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so in like 2014 days, that was very much our thing. The process that we took for finding Dauntless was very much a go to market and look for publishers and developers who are just not paying enough attention. And if we kind of look, we obviously took the hunting action Monster Hunter genre. At the time it was like Monster Hunter 3U, Togedin, and God Eater were the 3
Comps you had
emphasis.
basically.
And
Yeah.
like God Eater and Togedin aren't even around anymore.
Right.
They got crushed so horribly by the DS version of Monster Hunter. And at the time we were like, wow, this is like ripe for innovation.
Yeah, Capcom hadn't announced Monster Hunter Worlds yet.
They had not. And and if you kind of think about that time frame at the same time too, like Team Fortress 2 had just implemented hats, and Overwatch wasn't announced yet, and so, and that was another one of the potentials for us. Very much glad that we didn't pick that one. That would have not been fun. It was bad enough having Capcom scare the bejesus out of us,
Right.
but having Blizzard do it would have just been would have been worse.
We'd be having a different story right now.
Absolutely. But now if you kind of fast forward to 2024, when we started Queer About Games, like there are GDC talks and stuff about the concept of underserved on. You can go to Game Maker's Toolkit and see some random dude talk about that as a strategy. And so I think the availability of those plays is far more diminished. And as we learned about ourselves, we are not a scrappy mobile, get something to market in 15 minutes. Like, we do take our time. And so like whatever strategy we pick, needed to be somewhat resilient to taking, a multitude of years, not just a multitude of months. And
Mm,
so ultimately, we had to pick a strategy, one that at the same time, we were also staring down the barrel of, one of the worst financial crises in video games where,
yeah.
uh, everybody's going out of business, funding is zeroed out. Um, and so we needed to also do something that was very much, um, uh, in alignment with a much more affordable development model.
Yeah.
So that's just the picking side. And, ultimately we decided to do a new genre. So like, the super short form of that is like,
Got it.
we did a bunch of research and we're like, hey, we're going to go invent something new, or at least quasi new.
So that's
Yeah.
kind of the product background, and did some of that emerge again through that retrospective? Was that like sort of walking through that and kind of going, like the industry has changed, as you said, 2014 underserved market, kind of a new concept in PC console land, whereas by now, like you said, common,
Yeah.
everybody's talking about it.
Yeah, I think some of the games that we put into development later in Phoenix, the learnings around those, um, they didn't come out to market, but the process to put them into development was very similar to Dauntless, where we were looking at games that have an underserved market or an underserved audience, and what could we do that was different and interesting for them. And then as those games were in development, watching companies around us announcing games that followed a very similar model or a very similar idea, and realizing that like the thing that had been unique and different when we were getting Dauntless up on the off the ground was just so much less of a unique proposition now
Yeah.
in the 2020 onwards
Yes,
years.
and I think that um the overall, not only has the development and publishing landscape changed insofar as like how uh how fast you need to move, what kind of features are expected now, but also the amount of differentiation required to uh pull folks out of an experience and into a new one has dramatically changed as well. Like if,
Yeah.
again, if we come back to the 2014 version of Monster Hunter, like you bought, a cartridge, you put it into your 3DS, and then you were kind of like available for the next game. Kind of 15 days later, you
Yeah.
were more
Yep.
than happy to pick up another game. And I think a lot of kind of call it lifestyle products, if you will, exist now that didn't exist in the same way in 2014, where if let's use the Overwatch versus TF2 version of this, like in 2014 version of Team Fortress 2, there wasn't a lot holding you to that game, right? There
Right.
wasn't like a long history of kind of progression or a bunch of unlocks. Yeah, you had the hats, but that was about it.
Yep.
And fast forward to today and stuff like Overwatch, you've got skins, you've got a community built up, you've got a history, you've got um you've got all of your unlocks that you've gained through your battle passes and this kind of stuff. Those elements tie players to the game in a way that just didn't happen in those days.
Yeah.
And so like going head to head, even with a historically underserved group, or a group that doesn't serve their audience super well, is has gotten much, much, much more difficult
Yeah.
today. And I
Yeah.
think that that is, however, fundamentally in tension with the other side of the equation of like that risk balance of, the nice thing about an underserved audience plays, you already know that there are players there,
Yeah.
and I don't mind spending millions of dollars to go and service them because I know that they exist, and I don't have to pre-prove that this group exists. I only have to prove that I actually can give them something that they demand. Whereas now, as we think about our strategy of a new genre, not only do I have to do that second half of proving that I can give them something that they want to consume, but I actually have to go and figure out that group of humans.
Who they are. And
Yeah, and does anybody want this type of game, right? And that's a new and interesting problem for our industry, and I think most folks, especially in the like AA, AAA space, are very they're not super. excited by that problem set. Like money is so rare and so hard to come by right now that the idea of going after something that doesn't at least even have a predefined audience is very scary.
Yeah, there's almost I describe it as like a retreat into the known, as it's like, okay, what
Yep.
IPs do we already have? What sequels can we make? Do we have an existing, what I call a goose that lays a golden egg, right? Like a League of Legends or a Warframe or a World of
Yep.
Tanks or something that just like, hey, this thing just seems
Totally.
to be consistent and will run. There's
And if you go back in that Wayback Machine again in 2014, that was a very somewhat, we had just come out of 2012. When we started, you know, 2012 had kind of seen a major a financial collapse in the markets. VCs and gaming companies tend to like lag quite a bit behind those.
right.
So
Yep.
like,
Yep.
entertainment spending kind of continues in the early phases of recessionary behavior. And so like if you kind of get into the 2014, like we had just come out of like a really dark time of kind of late 2013, and most of the major publishers, to your point, have been retreating back into the knowns, right? Like the FIFAs were going, like the EAs are going more FIFA, less,
Yeah.
Mirror's Edge, and and so it is, and like more Call of Duty, less Jack and Daxter and that kind of stuff. And I think we're in that moment again where
Yeah.
the big folks and the investors this time are retreating back into the like, hey, how do I know that this is going to be successful?
Right. If you lead teams in game or software development and you're tired of wasteful and unreliable estimation, I've built an online course just for you. It's called Advanced Estimation for Game and Software Development, and it's a self-paced course with over 15 hours of content, real-world examples, and tools you can start using right away. Estimation doesn't have to be a morale-draining mess. Planning doesn't have to feel unrealistic and contrived. You can do better, and this course will help. Early access is now open with lifetime access and a big launch discount, but there's limited seats at this price point. Check it out at this URL or in the show notes below.